Welcome to Tech Talks. Our security edition today is focused on Phantom's join logic. Tech Talks is a series of short webinars that are deep dives for technical practitioners. We value you, our customer, and want you to continue in your Splunk journey. Our experts help create these best practices, and we want you to leverage them in your daily role. I'm Olivia Courtney, a security product marketing specialist, and I'm excited to share some information with you about Splunk Phantom and introduce my colleague, Sam Hayes.
Yep, this is Sam Hayes, and I work on the product management team. I'm here to help demystify some Phantom internals by describing in some detail how the action blocks interact with each other under some specific circumstances, in particular when they're fanned out and then fanned back in again.
Thanks, Sam. Today we'll talk about how VPE action blocks connect to each other. We'll show you what happens when Phantom playbook action blocks fan out and in. We'll explain how this may affect your playbook execution. We'll help you understand the importance of good design choices in Phantom's visual playbook editor, and we'll provide you with additional resources to continue on your Splunk journey.
Thanks, Olivia. So we've got a lot to cover here. So instead of me talking about it right now, why don't we jump right into the demo and discussion.
Okay, so what we're trying to do here is demystify the join blocks and the join settings here in the Phantom Visual Playbook Editor. But before we kind of do the deep dive that I am intending for today, let me remind you what the join settings are. So if I click on one of these action blocks and I look at advanced settings, you can see that there's a join settings option, and this one is blank, and also this one will be blank. And that's because we're not collapsing back into a single block. So in this case, over here on the format block, we're going to not have a blank join setting. So let's click that and go down to advanced settings and join. And you can see here, I've got some settings in here. And what these are saying, is this required and this required for this block to execute and continue running, or maybe only this one's required, maybe only this one's required, maybe neither are required. And so this is the question we want to get into. But before we dig too deeply into kind of the UI elements, what I want to do is take a step back and look at how the system actually works under the hood. So let me just delete this block here, and we're going to look at some code. Now, you don't have to be a Python wizard to follow what I'm saying. It might be a little helpful to follow along with the syntax, but I'm going to explain everything as best I can as we move through this discussion. So I'm looking at the code for the lookup IP. Now it says lookup IP 3 because this is the third time I've dropped a lookup IP block on the VPE, so you can kind of ignore that number. But at the end of this function, and in Python, this def kind of defines a function, and then we end at the return statement. So here what we have is this Phantom act, which is telling Phantom that it's going to be running an action. And then these are parameters and then arguments to the parameter. So action and lookup IP is the parameter and the argument. The only one we really care about for this discussion, though, is this callback format 2. And the callback is telling Phantom, hey, when we're done, I want you to call this function. And so you'll notice if I click on format 2, def format 2 is the name of the function. So what's happening is this action block gets run, lookup IP, and then when it's done, it will do a callback for format 2, which is down here. Now this isn't the only way that downstream functions get called, so let's take a quick look at that. So actually, I'm just going to disconnect this so I don't have to reconfigure it later. Just move that out of the way. Okay, let me make a format block. So I'll connect the format block. Now, if we look at the code for this format block, it does not use the callback syntax. You'll notice that I've got this Phantom format is kind of the key function that's being called. And I do have parameters and arguments the same as I did before, but you'll notice that there's no callback here. And instead, after phantom.format is finished, we just call the next block by name right here. So there's no callback argument or callback parameter with a function argument. It's just calling the next function directly and passing in the container. So that's another way that this can happen. Yet another way, let's just take a couple more examples. If I make a, let's say, manual task block, and I connect that, and we look at the code, then you can see here, it's a different function. It's not phantom.act, it's phantom.task, but it still uses kind of the callback design pattern. And we'll just take one more as an example. So here what we want to do is create a playbook. And I'm bringing this up because these can run synchronously or asynchronously, and that looks a little bit different. So I'll just say number blocks, and we'll connect this. Okay, so in this case, you can see that it uses the format block, sort of just like, it uses the direct call, just like the format block does. So we've got format2 is called after this phantom.playbook is run. Now what's interesting is that this runs asynchronously, right? So what that means is this playbook is going to be invoked, and then immediately the format block is going to happen, and so they might be running simultaneously. But if we turn on synchronous, you can see that the direct call, this direct call, vanishes, and instead it becomes a callback. So once we turn on synchronous, what happens is we don't get to the next block until this one is completed. So I've been clicking around and showing you individual blocks here, but we can look at the entire playbook. So if I click on this button over here, full playbook, we can see that we've got lookup IP3, that's this guy floating out here. We've got format2 over here. We've got playbook local number blocks right here, and the onFinish block, and we should also have a onStart block right here. So all of these blocks really is just Python code being executed, and what varies with the way that they're communicating with each other is just sort of the way the downstream block is called. So you noticed I clicked over here to show the full playbook, but also if I click on an individual action, I can come over here and you can see I have the function block, and I have these two kind of grayed out sections right here. And let's just look at format, right? So these are both grayed out. But let's imagine that I connect this and this. So now this format block is being joined, right? Because there's two things connecting to it, and we can see here that it has some join logic. And if I click it, I can click here, and then I can click join function. So that's pretty interesting. So what's actually happening here? Let's take a step back and look. So I'm going to again disconnect this block from this block so we can kind of see what's happening in code. Okay, so here we've got this block connecting to format2. But if I connect this block and look here again, well, now what we've got is a callback to join format2. And interestingly, if I look at this function, the callback here as well is join format2. But if I look at the code here in the format block, this is only format2. So where and what is this magical join format2 function? What is that? We don't see it in the code. Well, there's two ways we can see what that actually looks at. First way is we can look at the full playbook, and we can see that there is a join format2. Okay, that's interesting. But also we could just look at this code, come down here and say, let's look at the join function. Now to kind of map what we're seeing with the user interface, let's look at the join settings over here. Okay, so what we see is that both of these blocks in front of this block are required. Okay, and if we look at the code, we can say if phantom.complete, and then we have a playbook and we have action names. So these are all of the things that must be complete. If both of these are complete, then we're going to invoke the format2 block. Now, if I uncheck, let's say, the playbook here. Now what happens is some logic is put into the format block that says, well, it's possible that, I'm called multiple times. So if I'm called the first time, we want to say that we've already been called. And then if it's called the second time, then we're going to say, you can see that the auto-generated comments essentially tell us what's happening here is that it's just going to drop out. It's not going to actually do anything the second time it's called. But with the setting as is, with a single lookup 3, what we say is if the phantom complete lookup 3 has been done, then we're going to save the fact that that the join block has been called, and then we're going to call the format to block. So this block now is responsible for actually calling the format block. And again, this is not really visible in the UI outside of coming over here to the join function. So once you have multiple functions collapsing down into another function like this join function gets created, and then the logic around what you have clicked here is kind of represented in the code. So actually this is another case where I didn't explain. So let's say you don't have either of these required. So in that case, what happens is you'll notice there's no phantom.complete call anywhere in here, right? Like if I re-click this, you can see, oh, there's phantom.complete because it's looking to check if something's complete. But if I say nothing is required, then you can see that phantom.complete is not present. And instead, we just, as soon as the join function, this join format 2 is called, then we record using the say run data that it has been called, and we continue down to format 2 block. And if it gets called a second time, we get this get run data, and we say, oh, it's already been called, and we just don't do anything. So that's how we prevent executing the format code a bunch of times, even if there's nothing required. So next, we're going to talk about why you might want to fan out and some of the implications of fanning back in where you need to have a join function. So one reason you might want to fan out and do things in parallel, and I should say, by fan out, I mean you started one block and you come out and run multiple blocks in parallel. So one reason you might want to fan out is to just have things happening all at the same time instead of connecting block after block so they run sequentially. So in this case, I've got a lookup domain, I've got a lookup IP, and then it kind of terminates in this both done. So let's look at the join block over here. Okay, so both of these required. When both of these finish, I should be prompted. So let's go ahead and run that and have a look. Okay, it's previous run. We're going to test this on 126. Okay. So you can see over here, these things lookup have happened. And I've got a prompt that says both done. So that's great. Let's look at another use case. So let's look at a slightly more complicated example. And this is what you'll probably run into building real playbooks in the real world. So what we've got here is a yes or no question, right? So this is just so we can diverge the paths. And then I have a decision block that says, if the action was yes, we're going to go this way. And if otherwise, we're going to go this way. And then we end with a prompt that says which path was triggered. Okay, so let's save that and run it. 126 again. So we're going to run that. Come back over here. We can see that I've got my prompt. So yes or no. Why don't we say yes? Complete. But we didn't get the last prompt. Why didn't we get the last prompt? Let's look at the log. Well, we can see that the join logic was called, but not the actual prompt. So what happened here? Well, let's look at the join settings. So I look at this prompt. Let me edit this. Let me look at this prompt join set configuration here. Okay. And what we see is that, oh, I had these both marked as required. Well, in this case, it's impossible that they both finished, because right here I have a decision block that says if it was this, go this way, or if it was yes, go this way, and if it was no, then go this way. So over here, it's completely unreasonable for me to say I expect both of these previous blocks to have run, because again, we both can't run because we make a decision to go one way or the other from the decision before. So instead, the right thing to do here is say, well, we don't actually want either of these to be required. And that might seem counterintuitive because you think, well, one of them needs to be required. But you have to remember that by the time this is called, one of these has run. We don't know yet which one, and so we can't say either one is required. But what we can say is that one of them is going to run, and that one is going to call this, and then this will continue on down the path. But we don't know which one, and so we can't require either of them. We can't explicitly require either, but this will only be called once one of them has run. So that's kind of the guarantee. So let's save this and demo that. So I'll run this again. And I have my prompt. And this is my yes or no prompt, and I'll say yes. And I'll hit complete. And you can see now I have a prompt waiting yet again, and the yes path was triggered. And this is also great. So again, in a case like this, where you have some logic where you're branching out if yes or if no or whatever, and I'm using a basic kind of example here where it's just a prompt and a decision block, but it could be a virus total score, it could be any number of things. So this is a case where the decision is sort of irrelevant to the conversation. It's about the blocks coming back together. And let's look at just one more example. So let's look at this case here. What we have here is 3 actions happening in parallel and then being rejoined down here on this prompt block where we just say done. And this is a Phantom add note for the Phantom app on Phantom. Top and bottom are the same Google DNS calls that we've been making. So a case like this, this might be, the center here might be critical path, where this has to happen and then I get prompted. And perhaps these outside blocks are just enriching data or collecting new data to put into the container for us. So we don't, maybe that's not something that we need to move forward as we go through the playbook, but it's something we want to collect anyway. So in this case, I say the note, the center, has to finish. I want the note to finish, but the lookup IP and the lookup domain, I don't really care about those things. Those can kind of finish as they do, but we're going to keep going as soon as we're done. Now that means that I can't put a reliance on this being done when I call this block. And in fact, I could just leave these disconnected like that, and it would essentially have the same effect, because now I have no join block. So they're still all going to be called. These are all going to run, and everything will continue on. In fact, let's just do that as a demonstration. So here we have 3 things. We're going to call 126. All right. And we can see that lookup IP was called, lookup domain was called, add note was called. If we pivot back over to the container, we can see that done. Okay. So that's great. But if you're like me, you might want to always have your blocks connected. I always like to have the blocks connected for whatever reason. And so in a case like that, I have to remember to come to my join settings and say, well, wait a minute, I don't want these 2 to be required. Rather, I just want the add node. So I'll save that. And this should be exactly the same behavior that we just saw. So to run it again. Right, I have the done, okay, and the other things also ran, but the prompt wasn't relying on those to have completed. So again, what we've got is really kind of three use cases. We've got the parallelism, where you have two blocks or some number of blocks that are running in parallel, and only once they're all done do you collapse back down. That's the first example we saw. The second example we saw is where you might have a condition, and in that case, you don't want either of the blocks to actually be required. You just want one of them to call the next downstream block. And so in that case, you would uncheck all of the boxes. And then finally, there's this async thing where you might have some blocks that you want to run, but they're not critical path to the rest of the playbook. And a case like that might be, I want to enrich the IPs that I find and the domains that I find, but really what I need to do is, open a ServiceNow ticket for another group or something like that, and continue when that's done. So you could do those enrichments simultaneously, but the ServiceNow path is the only one that would be required as you move.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that presentation and demo. We're about ready to wrap up this Tech Talk, but before we do, I wanted to share quick resources available to you to continue on your journey. You'll receive these assets in a follow-up email as well as the recording. Check out Splunk Docs, where we have further documentation on Phantom join settings. If you're ready to try Phantom for yourself, try our free community edition. And if you have any product feedback or questions, drop us an idea at ideas.splunk.com. And of course, don't forget that we have an incredible community of Splunk users on our community site. You can search the answers section on Phantom Join Logic, and you can continue the conversation for this talk with the discussion section called Tech Talks. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to join us today. Please tune back in for future Tech Talks. We are excited to share this series with you.